In times of disaster, impacts and losses can substantially reduce if authorities, individuals and communities are equipped with the knowledge and capacity for effective disaster management and are well prepared and ready to act. From tsunamis to earthquakes, droughts, famine and many more, the wake-up call has been the need for a paradigm shift from post-disaster response to an effective proactive disaster risk reduction. The 68th session of the UN, following up on the resolution reached at the World Conference held in Kobe, Hyogo, Japan from 18th to 22nd January 2005, requested a 10-year framework for an action in disaster reduction. The United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction was mandated to facilitate the development of a post-2015 framework for this attempt at disaster risk reduction. Ahead of the 2015 date, various consultations are expected to be held to achieve this goal locally, nationally, regionally and globally. The climax of it all being the third World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction to be held in Japan in 2015. Quite clearly, disaster risk reduction has become the new mantra, and it is indeed one of the high priorities for the development of a society free from disaster. In the growing voices advocating this approach, Africa too is not left out. Many African countries today have several stories to tell. There are stories of economies growing at astounding rates and also that of war, conflict and sometimes stories of disasters. In the case of the last item on the list, stories of disasters are either man-made or natural. The level of impact that these disasters have had on the continent remain indelible. The battle, however, continues and more ways to mitigate the effects of disaster are being evolved. Topping the list is Africa's Regional Forum for Continued and Concerted Efforts on Disaster Reduction, provision of strategic guidance and coherence for implementing disaster management strategies. The federal government, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, Regional Office for Africa, Africa Union AU and Economic Community of West Africa ECOWAS through the National Emergency Management Agency Nema hosted the 5th Africa Regional Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in ABUJA at the Transcorp Hilton Hotel from the 13th to the 16th of May 2014.
It is my honor and privilege to welcome you to this momentous gathering.
Nigeria was among the 168 countries that adopted a resolution for the implementation of a 10-year international disaster risk strategy known as the Hyogo Framework for Action at the World Conference on Disaster Reduction in Hyogo, Japan in 2005. It certainly was no surprise that Nigeria was at the center stage for formalizing and strengthening the finalization of Africa's position on the 2015 framework for disaster reduction. The Secretary to the Government of the Federation, Senator Ayem Pius Ayem, who represented President Goodluck Ebele Jonathan, was on hand to declare the forum open.
As you consider and articulate the African position, you must be conscious of the fact that conflict-induced risks have also become very disastrous in Africa and may need to gain your consideration as you articulate the African position. Again, we must also bear in mind that the general increase in population in the last few decades has placed more people at risk whenever an extreme weather disaster occurs in Africa. This is also at the significant increase in human settlement and urbanization with attendant competition for livelihood has forced people to encroach on floodplains, resulting in increase in the risk of urban flooding.
Countries that develop policy frameworks for disaster risk reduction and that are able to develop measurable indicators have greater capacity to manage risks. They are also able to achieve widespread consensus for engagement in and compliance with disaster risk reduction measures across all sectors of the society.
Since then, it was like a wake-up call.
Nigeria seems to be one of such countries, and the Secretary to the Government of the Federation added that under the present administration, Nigeria has, over the years, taken a giant step in risk reduction.
Let me at this juncture also share with us the experience we have lately in the year 2012. For quite a long time in our history, we never encountered such flooding. And we were taken unawares in the year 2012 by extreme flooding across the country. The north was impacted, the south was affected, and indeed, across the country, the impact was huge. Since then, it was like a wake-up call to us to realize that whether we like it or not, we must prepare for any eventuality. And I want to say that since then, I've taken extra steps to make sure that Nema is strengthened and indeed the private sector groups are involved in preparing for such eventualities.
Mohammed Sanisidi of the National Emergency Management Agency is one man who knows firsthand that disaster and their attendant humanitarian consequences have the capability of creating recipes for crisis and insecurity.
The African peculiarities, like conflict prevention and management, people living with disabilities need to be pushed as part of the priority in the year from action.
He advocates that stakeholders at the meeting should share experiences and thoughts in order to come up with a panacea for reducing Africa's vulnerability to disasters and building resilience of communities in Africa.
Given the fact that disasters are always local, the National Emergency Management Agency, Nema, which has the responsibility of coordinating disaster management in Nigeria, is focused on risk reduction at the community level. In this regard, state and local governments are required to establish state emergency management agencies and local emergency management committee at the local level to coordinate emergency management in their areas of jurisdiction.
His line of thought is strongly echoed by the over 900 participants from 44 countries who come together to review the progress of disaster risk reduction in Africa and consolidate Africa's contribution to a post-2015 framework for disaster risk reduction.
Africa, a bit ahead of the rest of the world, in fact, had formulated its approach to disaster risk reduction because you knew this was going to have a serious impact on development. So we would like to have a very strong message from Africa also now to influence this global framework in terms of what have our successes been. Let's not just talk about the problems, let's celebrate some successes as well, but also to contribute to set the agenda for the world and also how this agenda will influence the development vision of the world and how we can link it in very practical terms to the climate change issues that are such a big part of your challenges in this.
We need to look at, for example, enhancing risk assessment and institutional frameworks. We need to look at integrating of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. We need to look at investments in disaster risk reduction with an effort of scaling it up. We need to look at enhancing commitments and also getting the leadership appreciate the importance of GRR. All these are fundamental for transforming development to manage risk, to seize opportunities, and strengthen resilience.
This has become urgent as these common enemies are being fueled by climate change and insurgency. Consequently, our actions or inactions have regional implications. As the host city, we look forward to being the immediate beneficiary of the new ideas that will be canvassed here in the next few days.
We therefore believe that reducing disaster risk as a measure to build resilience for sustainable development is a critical challenge of the day. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in order to play a key role in reducing the vulnerability of West African people and communities, a number of major efforts have been undertaken at the regional and national levels through the implementation of a number of interrelated programs and activities.
It is therefore important to advance the mainstreaming of disaster risk reduction, namely introducing the DDR perspective in every development efforts. And it is therefore essential to clearly position disaster risk reduction in the post-2015 development agenda.
Much like the last forum, which was held in Arusha, Tanzania, where participants reviewed the achievements and challenges in implementing the Africa Regional Strategy for Disaster Reduction, the fifth platform was unequivocal about Africa's regions uniting in the fight against disasters through adequate sensitization campaign. Participants were divided into sections for a plenary session for proper review to chart a course for the coming year, 2015. The plenary session kicked off with each country presenting the results of the assessment carried out at Reducing Risk Management, with Ethiopia enumerating the various ways its government has been tackling the issue of food security problem.
We should not continue to deliver food. 20 years repeatedly getting the food means they are in a critical food insecure. So we designed a program where we tackle their root cause of a problem. So the product safety net program is a program for these people to be engaged, but they will be paid either food or cash.
Learning from past experience in dealing with future occurrence and creating an avenue for risk assessment and reassessment on daily basis with the pivotal starting point in discussion. It later veered into some of the experts highlighting the need for the inclusion of disaster risk reduction in municipal and decentralized policies.
I think if we are going to be successful in really embedding risk in citizens' mind is start with citizens in urban areas, in rural areas, work with groups, educate, talk about risk, talk about what doing to mitigate.
Decentralization, they say, should be complemented by increased accountability and transparency in implementing disaster risk reduction through allocation of responsibilities and resources at all administrative levels. Public participation in policy development, they say, will better ensure that particular vulnerabilities of children, youth, women, elderly and persons with disabilities, among others, are addressed and will help to ensure that the leadership and capacities of these groups are fully enlisted in efforts to build resilience.
Our farmers, they're completely disappointed. They don't know, as you said, when the rain will start, when it will stop, how do they do it. That we need to put to help them, to bring this knowledge with meteorology and all of the monitoring to them, because otherwise we will create another disaster, which is hunger, and will come conflicts.
We are very far from communication centers, we are a little bit remote, we are drought prone, we are very vulnerable people, even watering points are great distances apart. We need reliable, concrete and timely weather information so that if there are droughts impending, which are our greatest bother, we are told in advance so that we can do the stocking, pre-positioning for food, placing, contingency pastures and all this. If we don't get this, then we are caught unawares.
At the end of the day, the most single unit is the individual that is affected, that local businessman who depends on fishing, for his livelihood. That person is going to be impacted by sea level rise, by inundated flood water. You think about the woman who, is a farmer in a very local community. If she has no access to information on weather patterns and when drought is coming and when there'll be too much rain or not enough rain, her farming and her livelihood is going to be affected.
The third Africa Ministers and Heads of Delegation meeting, which took place at the event, saw the continent's key decision makers also contributing their input to the discourse.
Nigeria, and indeed the global community, have benefited greatly from the Yogo Framework for Action, the HFA 2005 to 2015. We would therefore support the UNIFDA. And so Margareta, the Special Representative to the Secretary General on DRR, to ensure that the United Nations puts in a successor framework to improve resilience globally.
Just like to convey to all of you is it is the inclusive participation of young people, community groups, parliamentarians and local government is a very significant step forward the way you have represented in your statement. In fact, that's going to help many countries around the world to think through how they use all capacities in society.
The question and answer session dwells more on the cross-fertilization of ideas between African neighboring countries on how best to reduce disasters and response in times of help. Likewise, the role of women in disaster management.
So if you look at the HFA2, this important role of women is minimally mentioned. And we would request that these women be brought on board if we are to build resilient societies that will stand the test. This is my humble request this afternoon. Thank you very much.
The role of women, especially organized groups of slum dwellers and rural women, they say, would be recognized through inviting their involvement in decision-making, policy and program design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation towards the goal of gender equity and women's empowerment. Of tackling the question of infrastructure in disaster risk management. Those who dealt with the issue say infrastructure relies mostly on a grid system which can easily be affected by natural disasters. They preferred solutions for fail-safe mechanism in the event of disasters.
But I just want to give reassurance to those who still have doubts. I want to repeat that we do know the role of parliamentarians and what they can do and not do. We intend to do what helps DRR in terms of our legislative work and our oversight. What we are asking for, even in terms of support by UNHCR and others, is to be able to do the representation, which of course, as you can hear generally, is where I think the weak link is.
We don't need to mobilize people who don't know the terrain, don't know the community, don't know the long-term impacts. I think I've seen a lot of projects that were trying to support communities by doing a housing, taking it out of the flooding zone and moving them to a new location. But the issue of schools or jobs wasn't considered, and it's something that if we were working in partnership with communities, they would have mentioned from the onset. You can't move people far outside the city, far away from jobs. They'll appreciate the homes, but they won't have jobs to be able to pay for their homes and pay for their schooling. So I think I'd like to just stress that we look at what's already there. We map who are the stakeholders, map what are they doing, so that before disasters happen, we're already aware of what the full set of capacities are beyond the formal institutions that exist.
The knowledge that the community has, with the science that can be brought in, together we can make our resilience work better.
We are hoping to link the work we've been doing with the work of the national platforms and bring in an organized voice into the national platforms.
To make sure that I can produce evidence to show my people that climate is changing. When will it change? Where will it change? How much will it change? And what are the consequences? That is my role, and I have to do it, and that's what I struggle to do. Beyond that now is a policy decision. And when the policy people are informed by science, they will actually take appropriate decision. Like now, we are doing economical damages of extreme rainfall and drought development. What we are seeing now, when you pass them over to the policymakers, it is exciting that they see they have to do something so that the future similar climate extremes do not actually destroy development.
Other contributors to the plenary session called for an emergency early warning mechanism during reassessment which can help foretell climate disaster. They called for public reporting mechanism to be put in place for sub-national, urban and community-level disaster risk reduction programs.
Going forward, the United Nations system in Nigeria, through its UNDAF, United Nations Development Assistance Framework 3, has formulated an integrated intervention on DRR for rollout from 2014 to 2017.
They also posited that efforts should be made to identify relationship between poverty and corruption, and it should be viewed as a valuable asset in efforts to promote resilience to disasters. The last day of the event was presided over by Director General of Nema, Mohammed Sani Sidi, who highlighted the efforts of the Nigerian government at tackling transboundary disasters, terrorism and human trafficking. He said disasters are not constrained by administrative boundaries and require transboundary policies and programs, and that population movement induced by disasters, fast and slow onset, and long-term violent conflicts call for cross-border cooperation. The federal government, he says, is poised at ensuring that disaster in the country is managed to the barest minimum.
We must continue to be our brothers' keepers in Africa. Nigeria has extended her support to many African countries in disaster response and relief. We are ready to collaborate on disaster risk reduction with our sister African nations. We'd like to thank the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction.
Disaster reduction, in the estimation of experts, should be an everyday decision taken by the peoples of the world, and that is the resolution of the platform as the 3-day event came to a close.
The platform was convened by the African Union Commission and hosted by the Federal Republic of Nigeria with support from Economic Community for West African States Commission and United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and other partners. The recommendations are summarized below. Section A, regional risk factors and institutional frameworks. Most disasters in Africa are hydrometeorological. Drought in particular is recognized as a regional priority, along with chronic vulnerabilities and food insecurity. The impact of small-scale recurrent hazards continue to have a significant impact on sustainable development and call for greater attention in national and regional efforts to reduce disaster risk. Recognizing regional vulnerability in hazard profiles, the particular vulnerabilities of island states need to be reflected in regional strategies and action. Rapid urbanization, vulnerable infrastructure, land environmental degradation and extreme poverty, food insecurity and disease continue to drive risk and undermine resilience. Violent conflict is closely associated with disaster risk, and related efforts to prevent conflict need to be considered as part of overall efforts to build resilience to disasters. 1. Policy and appropriate legislation, including regulatory frameworks, have played a significant role in addressing disaster risks in many African countries. These processes should be enhanced, including through parliamentary forums at regional and national levels, and backed by strengthened institutional capacity to enforce legislation. 2. The inclusion of disaster risk reduction into municipal and decentralized policies will further enable the reduction of risk. Decentralization should be complemented by increased accountability and transparency in implementing disaster risk reduction through allocation of responsibilities and resources at all administrative levels. 3. Public participation in policy development will better ensure that particular vulnerabilities of children, youth, women, elderly, and persons with disabilities, among others, are addressed and will help to ensure that the leadership and capacities of these groups are fully enlisted in efforts to build resilience. 4. Multi-sector and multi-hazard program investment frameworks with clear budgets will help in translating policies into actionable programs, particularly when attention is given to capacity building and capacity retention at all levels, policymakers, community practitioners.
What has been discussed here is important. What is going to be done after this is even more important, and that is what counts for us. Thank you.
I think in terms of political commitment, that is there. But I mean, it's a process. It deals with trying to change mindset. You know, we don't expect overnight solutions here. But I think this platform is an important milestone in consolidating that kind of positive mindset, that kind of real positive political commitment and leadership in addressing DRR. We are on the way. The challenges are there. They might be daunting, but I think the commitment is there. Now the challenge is, especially on you, the journalists. You must help us to keep the fire on.
We cannot change it. Therefore, the best way to go is to come up with a very strong African adaptation strategy. We must prioritize disaster risk reduction. We must invest heavily in it. And I do hope that this platform will be the beginning of a new chapter